Father Daniel adjusted the strap of his satchel as the spires of St. Callisto Cathedral emerged through the dense fog. The structure stood like a sentinel of despair, its darkened stone walls marred by time and neglect. The intricate carvings on its facade, once majestic, now seemed grotesque in their erosion, as if weather and shadows had conspired to twist them into something unholy. The villagers had spoken in hushed tones about the cathedral, refusing to accompany him there. "It's cursed," they had murmured, averting their eyes. But Daniel had brushed off their warnings. He was a man of faith and logic, an artist dedicated to preserving sacred beauty, no matter how daunting the task. Yet, as he approached the heavy oak doors, an uneasy sensation crept up his spine. The air grew colder when he stepped inside. The grand interior was cloaked in darkness, its once vibrant stained-glass windows muted under decades of grime. His footsteps echoed through the cavernous nave, a sound that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The weight of the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of wood under his boots. Daniel set his satchel down near the altar, where the frescoes loomed. Even under layers of dirt, the murals hinted at their former glory. Cherubic figures soaring amidst golden clouds, the righteous ascending to heaven. But one figure caught his eye, a dark silhouette shrouded in black, starkly different from the divine imagery around it. The figure seemed out of place, its presence both jarring and deliberate. As Daniel stared at the fresco, the cathedral's doors slammed shut with a deafening thud. He spun around, his heart pounding. No wind, no hands, yet the sound reverberated like a finality. A shiver coursed through him as he turned back to the altar. The shadows along the walls appeared to flicker, as though alive. For the first time, Daniel wondered if the villagers' warnings had held more truth than superstition. Daniel lit a candelabra he found near the altar, its dim flames casting long, trembling shadows across the cathedral's walls. The frescoes seemed to come alive in the flickering light, their cherubic figures smiling faintly, as though mocking him. But it was the shrouded figure in black that held his attention. Unlike the others, its paint seemed fresher, glossier, as if it had been added long after the original design. He retrieved his tools and began cleaning a section of the fresco near the bottom, brushing away centuries of grime. As the vibrant colors re-emerged, a chill swept through the nave, rustling the edges of his robes. Daniel paused, glancing toward the arched windows. The wind couldn't have reached this far inside, he thought, unease creeping into his mind. Hours passed. He worked in silence, disturbed only by faint creaks and whispers he attributed to the building settling. Yet, the whispers grew louder, forming no discernible words, but filling the air with an oppressive weight. It was then he noticed something unusual. Faint outlines beneath the painted clouds in the fresco. Intrigued, Daniel scraped gently with his chisel, uncovering hidden details beneath the original layer. Faces, dozens of them, frozen in silent agony, their wide eyes staring directly at him. His breath caught as he stumbled backward, nearly dropping his tools. Who would have hidden these within a sacred mural? The faintest sound of laughter echoed behind him. He turned quickly, but the nave was empty. Shaken, he decided to rest, but as he packed his tools, something fell from a nearby pew. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Flipping through its pages, he discovered it belonged to a previous artist who had worked on the cathedral years ago. The entries began innocently enough but grew frantic, filled with warnings about the shadows and the saint. The final page read, "Do not disturb them. They will take you too." The candelabra flickered violently, one flame extinguishing itself. Daniel's heart raced as the shadows around him seemed to deepen, coiling like tendrils along the walls. The journal consumed Daniel's thoughts as he resumed his work the next day. Its fragmented accounts described mysterious disappearances, priests, artists, even townsfolk who had dared enter the cathedral alone. One chilling passage stood out: "The saint watches. The shadows obey." Determined to find answers, Daniel scoured the cathedral for clues. He examined every corner, his unease growing as he noticed more peculiarities. The carvings on the pews twisted into distorted figures when viewed from certain angles, and the once muted stained glass now glimmered faintly, despite the lack of sunlight. Then came the footsteps. They started faintly, echoing from the far end of the nave. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, the sound grew louder, deliberate. He turned, clutching a rusted candle holder for protection. No one was there. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The only response was the deepening shadows, which seemed to pulse like a living thing. As he backed toward the altar, his eyes returned to the fresco. The shrouded figure in black was different. Its position had shifted subtly but unmistakably. The head, which had previously faced forward, now turned slightly, as though watching him. Panic clawed at Daniel, but curiosity anchored him. He approached the fresco and ran his fingers over the black paint. It felt cold, slick, almost like flesh. A sudden, guttural whisper echoed in his ears, "Chosen." Staggering back, Daniel stared in horror as the figure's painted eyes began to glow faintly, a sickly yellow hue. The whispering grew louder, forming a chant that resonated within his skull. Desperate to break the spell, he hurled holy water at the fresco. The chant ceased instantly, and the glow faded, but the shadows surrounding him writhed angrily, retreating only to the edges of the nave. The realization struck him like a blow. The Shadow Saint wasn't just a figure of legend. It was alive, bound to the cathedral, and now it had noticed him. Sleep eluded Daniel that night. Even in the small room he'd claimed as his quarters, the oppressive presence of the cathedral seeped through the walls. His candle burned low, its faint light casting ominous shapes that danced and twisted. He thought he heard faint whispers, but exhaustion dulled his senses. The next morning, he returned to the fresco, determined to uncover more of its secrets. He began cleaning another section, but his hands trembled, and his heart pounded with every stroke. As he worked, the faces beneath the surface became clearer. Priests, villagers, and artists, their expressions a mixture of terror and pain. The shadows grew more aggressive. They moved deliberately now, slithering across the walls and pulling at his feet. Cold, invisible hands brushed against his skin, and distorted figures emerged briefly before vanishing. Desperation pushed Daniel to explore deeper into the cathedral. He stumbled upon a hidden door behind the altar, its edges marked with strange symbols. Inside, he found a small chamber. Candles, long since burned out, surrounded a blood-stained chalice. A broken cross rested nearby, its edges sharp and jagged. As he examined the items, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, chilling word: "Stay." The air grew heavier, and the room seemed to tilt. Shadows seeped in from the doorway, their movements slow but deliberate. One tendril wrapped around Daniel's wrist, cold and firm, pulling him toward the fresco visible through the open door. He fought back, breaking free and fleeing the chamber. The fresco seemed to glow faintly now, its painted figures shifting, their mouths open in silent screams. The shrouded figure of the Shadow Saint loomed larger, its black form more defined. Daniel's terror mounted as he realized the truth. The cathedral wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it hungered for him. Daniel clutched his tools tightly as he faced the fresco. The shrouded figure stepped forward, no longer confined to the painting. Its form was vast and imposing, its face obscured by a swirling void. Shadows poured from it like smoke, filling the nave with an oppressive darkness. "You cannot escape," the figure intoned, its voice a deep, resonant growl. "You are chosen, as they were before you." "No," Daniel shouted, splashing holy water at the advancing figure. The creature recoiled, its form flickering, but the shadows pressed closer. Desperate, Daniel grabbed his chisel and began carving into the fresco, scraping away the faces beneath the paint. The shadows screamed in unison, their voices piercing and unearthly. As he worked, he felt his own reflection becoming clearer in the fresco. The Shadow Saint grew weaker, its form flickering and fading, but Daniel's face began to take shape in the painting, its expression one of terror. The shadow sink collapsed into ash, and the shadows recoiled, retreating to the edges of the cathedral. Exhausted and trembling, Daniel collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The silence was deafening. The cathedral felt lighter, its oppressive atmosphere seemingly lifted. Daniel staggered toward the door, his legs weak but his heart swelling with relief. As he stepped outside, sunlight bathed the surrounding landscape. Yet something felt wrong. The villagers who had gathered nearby stared at him with wide eyes, whispering amongst themselves. He turned to look back at the cathedral. The fresco was restored, vibrant and untouched by his chisel. But at its center, where the shadow saint once loomed, was his own face. Daniel's heart sank as he realized the truth. He hadn't destroyed the curse. He had only become its newest victim. The villagers claimed they could still hear whispers emanating from the cathedral, calling to them, promising salvation. And deep inside, Daniel's painted likeness stared out from the fresco, his expression frozen in eternal terror. Eleanor Carter parked her car just outside the gates of the Grand Mercian Hotel, its once opulent structure now looming in decay. The wrought iron gates, twisted with rust and vines, creaked as she pushed them open, revealing the crumbling facade of a building that had once been a beacon of luxury. Ivy snaked up its walls, and shattered windows gaped like empty eyes staring into the overcast sky. As a travel journalist, Eleanor was no stranger to eerie places. Her editor had suggested the Grand Mercian as a perfect feature for her Lost Treasures column. She'd read stories of its golden age, a bustling 1920s hotspot for the elite, where parties had lasted till dawn. But the hotel's mystery was what truly intrigued her. One fateful gala, its guests had vanished overnight, leaving behind an empty, silent shell. Clutching her camera, Eleanor ascended the cracked stone steps. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they swung open, revealing the lobby within. Dust blanketed the room like a shroud. A grand chandelier hung precariously, its crystals dulled by grime. The air was stale, carrying faint notes of mildew and something metallic. Her boots crunched on the marble floor as she stepped inside, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. There was a strange stillness here, not just the absence of people, but a feeling that the air itself had stopped moving. Eleanor's eyes swept the room, her journalist instincts kicking in. The ornate reception desk was warped and splintered, but behind it, she noticed a tarnished brass key rack still holding several room keys. Her gaze shifted to the grand staircase, its once plush carpet now threadbare. Something about the place felt off. Near a cracked mirror, a small table held a glass half filled with water, the liquid untouched and clear despite the dust covering everything else. Frowning, Eleanor leaned closer. Had someone been here recently? Shaking off her unease, she chose a suite on the second floor. If she was going to write this story, she needed to immerse herself in the experience. The sound of her footsteps climbing the stairs echoed strangely, as if the building itself was mimicking her movements. At the landing, she paused, turning to glance over her shoulder. The lobby below was empty, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone. With a determined breath, she pushed open the door to the suite, the hinges squealing in protest. Dust motes floated lazily in the pale light, seeping through a broken window. She set her bag down and began unpacking, forcing herself to focus. Tomorrow, she would start exploring the hotel. Tonight, she just needed to get through the silence. Eleanor woke early to a pale, watery light filtering through the cracked window. The air in her suite was unnaturally cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. After a restless night of strange creaks and the occasional distant thud, she was eager to begin her exploration. Her camera dangled from her neck as she stepped out into the corridor. The faded wallpaper, once adorned with intricate patterns, was now peeling and curling, revealing the raw plaster beneath. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, broken only by her careful footsteps. She entered the grand dining hall, a cavernous space lined with long, dust-covered tables. The chairs were arranged in haphazard clusters, some tipped over as if left in a rush. On one table, she found a vase with brittle, dead flowers still standing upright. Just leftover staging, she muttered to herself, snapping a picture. Her camera clicked, and the flash briefly illuminated the room. But when she reviewed the shot, her breath caught. The image showed faint outlines of figures seated at the table, blurred as if captured mid-motion. She quickly took another photo, but this time the figures were gone. Brushing off her unease, Eleanor moved toward the ballroom. The massive double doors creaked as she pushed them open, revealing a hauntingly beautiful space. The high ceiling boasted elaborate frescoes, though cracks now spiderwebbed across them. A grand chandelier hung above, swaying gently, though there was no breeze. Her boots scraped against the dusty floor as she approached the grand piano in the corner. She ran her fingers over the keys, producing a discordant note. As the sound echoed, faint music began to hum in the air, a soft, jazzy tune that seemed to come from nowhere. "Is someone here?" Eleanor called, her voice trembling. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the room eerily still. She turned to leave and caught movement in her peripheral vision. A figure, a woman in a shimmering flapper dress, disappeared around a corner. "Wait!" Eleanor called, rushing into the corridor. But the space ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls narrowing as the light dimmed. She stopped, her head spinning, and turned back toward the ballroom, only to find it further away than it should have been. Her breathing quickened. Something about this place was warping her sense of direction, as if the building itself was alive. She retraced her steps carefully, eventually stumbling back into the dining hall, her heart pounding. For the first time, Eleanor considered the possibility that the Grand Mercian stories might hold more truth than she had imagined. That night, Eleanor's sleep was broken by faint sounds. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, music. She sat up abruptly, straining to listen. The noises grew louder, seeming to come from the ballroom. Grabbing her flashlight, she crept into the corridor. The sounds grew clearer as she approached, lively jazz, a woman's laughter, and the unmistakable murmur of a crowd. She pushed open the ballroom doors, and her breath hitched. The room was alive with light and movement. The dusty floor was now polished to a gleaming shine, and the chandelier cast a warm, golden glow. Elegantly dressed men and women swirled across the floor, their laughter mingling with the music. But something was wrong. Their faces were blurred, as if smudged on a canvas. Their movements were fluid yet unsettling, like marionettes guided by unseen strings. Eleanor stood frozen at the threshold. One of the guests, a tall man in a sharp black suit, turned toward her. Though his face lacked definition, she felt his gaze pierce through her. The music slowed, and the dancers began to stop, all of them turning in unison to face her. "No," she whispered, backing away. The music warped, the notes twisting into a cacophony. The chandelier swayed violently, its crystals rattling. The blurred faces began to stretch and distort, their features melting into grotesque shapes. Eleanor stumbled into the corridor, slamming the doors shut behind her. She leaned against the wall, her heart racing. But the hallway felt different now, longer, darker, its edges dissolving into shadow. She bolted toward the stairs, ignoring the faint whispers that followed her, urging her to come back. When she finally reached her suite, she locked the door and sank onto the bed, clutching her knees. The Grand Mercian wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted her. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to find her camera on the floor, its lens cracked. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, but the tension in her chest told her it had been all too real. Determined to understand what she was dealing with, she decided to search the manager's office. The room, tucked behind the reception desk, was a time capsule of the 1920s. A mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface scattered with yellowed papers and broken fountain pens. Eleanor rifled through the desk drawers, finding old letters and financial ledgers. One letter stood out, written by Victor Grayson, the hotel's manager. "The benefactor assures us success. The gala will bring new life to the Grand Mercian." In return, we offer our utmost loyalty. The cryptic note chilled her. She uncovered more letters from staff, describing strange occurrences leading up to the gala. Guests arriving unannounced, their faces unnervingly blank, and whispers in empty halls. In a locked drawer, she found the ledger from the night of the gala. Her hands shook as she read through the names, guests, staff, entertainers. Near the bottom, she saw her own name, written in elegant script. Her stomach dropped. "That's impossible," she whispered. A faint sound made her look up. The shadows in the office seemed to stretch toward her, curling like smoke. She grabbed the ledger and stumbled out into the lobby, where her eyes landed on a display case by the wall. Inside was a golden pocket watch, its surface engraved with an ornate design. The watch seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The inscription read, "Time belongs to the chosen." The room grew colder. Eleanor heard her name whispered, low and drawn out. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but something kept her rooted in place. The hotel didn't just trap its victims, it claimed them. Eleanor knew she had to destroy the watch. Somehow, she felt it was the heart of the curse binding the Grand Mercian. She made her way to the dining hall, where she felt the oppressive energy most strongly. Victor Grayson was waiting for her. He stood at the head of the table, dressed impeccably in a tailored black suit. His smile was wide, too wide, and his eyes glimmered with something inhuman. "Welcome, Miss Carter," he said smoothly. "You've done well to uncover our secrets. Now join us. The celebration never ends." He gestured to a glass of wine on the table. Eleanor noticed the liquid inside was thick and dark, more like blood than wine. "I'm not here to join," she said, her voice steady. Victor's grin faltered. But you're already part of the story," he said, stepping closer. Eleanor grabbed a heavy candlestick and hurled it at the display case in the lobby. The glass shattered, and she snatched the pocket watch. Victor screamed, his voice distorted and echoing. "You don't understand what you're doing," he roared, his form flickering like a dying projection. Eleanor smashed the watch against the marble floor. A deafening roar filled the hotel as the walls trembled. Chandeliers crashed to the ground, and the shadows dissolved into nothingness. Eleanor stumbled out of the Grand Mercian, just as the sun began to rise. Behind her, the once grand building collapsed in on itself, leaving only rubble and silence. Weeks later, she published her article. It became a sensation, though she left out the supernatural details. Readers were drawn to the story of the vanished hotel and the mystery surrounding its fall. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly escaped. One night, as she wrote in her apartment, she heard faint jazz music drifting through the air. She looked out the window, but the street below was empty. Her reflection in the glass flickered. For a brief moment, she saw herself in a shimmering flapper dress, her face blank and lifeless. The music stopped, but the silence felt far too familiar. Margaret Hale tightened her scarf as she stepped out of her car, the brisk autumn wind biting at her cheeks. The looming silhouette of Ashwick Asylum stood ahead, its Gothic spires piercing the gray sky. Decayed yet imposing, the building seemed to draw the surrounding shadows closer, its shattered windows casting jagged reflections of the bleak afternoon light. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, a relic of a time when society tucked away its undesirables under the guise of care. Now, its crumbling walls whispered stories of despair and madness, amplified by the unsettling tales of Alfred Renwick, the painter who had lived and died within these walls. Renwick's murals, grotesque and vibrant, had gained a cult following in the art world, but it was their rumored ability to shift and change that drew Margaret here. Adjusting her satchel, Margaret approached the building. Vines coiled tightly around the wrought iron gate, which groaned in protest as she pushed it open. The path to the main entrance was overgrown, with weeds bursting through the cracks in the stone steps. A set of heavy wooden doors, their paint peeling and hinges rusted, stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air was damp and cold. Margaret's boots echoed on the marble floor of the grand entryway. the sound swallowed quickly by the cavernous space. The remnants of the asylum's past lingered in the form of faded wallpaper, a broken chandelier, and rows of cracked wooden benches lining the hall. A faint draft carried the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. She paused in front of a wall where paint had peeled away to reveal one of Renwick's murals. Even partially obscured, the image was striking, a swirl of distorted faces, their expressions twisted in anguish. Margaret felt the intensity of their stares, the painted eyes following her movements with unsettling precision. Brushing off the unease, she reached for her notebook and began jotting down observations. She reminded herself this was just a building, just art. Yet the silence felt heavier than it should have, pressing down on her shoulders like an unseen weight. "I'll start properly tomorrow," she murmured aloud, her voice echoing faintly. For now, she'd find a suitable room to set up her things. As Margaret ascended the staircase, the fading daylight made the shadows deepen. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Turning briefly at the landing, she glanced back at the main hall below, empty but unnervingly still. The next morning, Margaret awoke to a pale beam of light filtering through the cracked window of her chosen room. Despite the chill in the air, she felt eager to begin her work. The asylum was a treasure trove of forgotten art, and her task was clear: document Alfred Renwick's murals and understand the mind of the troubled artist. Her footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she moved from room to room, her camera slung over her shoulder and her sketchbook in hand. The first murals she encountered were bold yet unsettling. In one, a group of figures writhed together, their elongated limbs and anguished faces blending into a chaotic swirl of color. Margaret set up her tripod and carefully adjusted her lens, framing the mural for her first shot. The shutter clicked, and she moved on, immersing herself in Renwick's haunting visions. But as she reviewed the images on her camera later, she noticed something peculiar. In the photograph, one of the figures had turned its head slightly, its eyes now looking directly at her. She dismissed it as a trick of the light. Deeper into the asylum, Margaret found an unfinished mural in the basement. It depicted a massive open doorway, surrounded by shadowy figures. The space beyond the doorway was painted as a swirling void of black and gray. The paint looked disturbingly fresh, as if it had been applied only days ago. Shaking off the strange thought, Margaret decided to look through Renwick's journals, which she discovered the day before in a locked cabinet. The entries described Renwick's deteriorating mental state and his belief that the asylum itself was alive. He wrote of hearing whispers, of shadows that moved independently, and of feeling compelled to paint scenes he couldn't remember creating. That night, Margaret worked late in her room, sketching the murals she'd seen earlier. But when she stepped back to examine her sketches, they seemed subtly altered. The figures in the drawings appeared more twisted, their expressions more grotesque. A faint scratching sound interrupted her thoughts. Curious and uneasy, she followed the sound into the hallway. At the end of the corridor, on a wall that had been blank earlier, she found a new mural. It depicted her, standing exactly where she was now, with her sketchbook in hand. Margaret spent the following day wrestling with an uneasy feeling. The murals seemed to grow more disturbing the longer she studied them. She photographed and sketched compulsively, determined to capture every detail. But the more she worked, the less she trusted her senses. One mural in particular drew her back repeatedly. It depicted a crowd of people, their faces blurred and distorted. As Margaret studied it, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. One of the figures, a man near the edge of the painting, seemed to lift his arm slightly, reaching toward her. Margaret blinked, her heart racing. When she looked again, the figure's arm was back in place, but its expression had changed. Now it wore an anguished, almost pleading look. The sense of being watched grew stronger. As she moved from room to room, the shadows along the walls seemed to stretch unnaturally, following her movements. By midday, Margaret discovered Renwick's old studio. The room was cluttered with decayed art supplies, half-finished canvases, and streaks of paint on the walls. At its center was his most infamous work, a mural of a man with hollow eyes standing before a swirling black void. The void seemed alive, its surface shifting subtly, as if it were breathing. Margaret felt an overwhelming urge to step closer. Faint whispers filled her ears, promising understanding, power, release. She reached out toward the painting, her fingers inches from the surface, before she pulled back abruptly. The room seemed to darken around her. Margaret stumbled out of the studio, her pulse racing, and returned to the main hall. The figures in the murals now watched her with unmistakable intent, their painted eyes following her every step. Margaret locked herself in her room that evening, determined to make sense of what she had seen. Renwick's journals, scattered across her desk, offered fragments of clarity. One passage caught her attention. The asylum thrives on despair. It consumes us, twisting our fears into forms it can use. My paintings are not mine. They are its voice, its cries. Margaret pieced together the story. Renwick believed the asylum was alive, a sentient entity that fed on the emotions of its residents. His art had become a channel for the asylum's suffering. The swirling void in his final mural was his desperate attempt to trap the entity, sealing it within the painting. But something had gone wrong. The unfinished mural in the basement, Margaret realized, was the asylum's latest attempt to free itself. It had chosen her as its next conduit. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low creak. The air in the room grew colder, and she saw movement in the corner of her eye. Turning slowly, she saw her reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. It wasn't her. The figure in the mirror was distorted, its features warped into a grotesque grin. Margaret's breath hitched as the mirror cracked further, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. She fled into the hallway, only to find herself standing before the basement mural. The swirling void now depicted her, standing on the edge of the shadowy doorway, her face twisted in terror. In her hand, she held a paintbrush, though she didn't remember picking one up. Margaret knew she had to destroy the murals. If they were the asylum's voice, silencing them might weaken its hold. Armed with white paint and brushes she'd scavenged from Renwick's studio, she began painting over the smaller murals in the main hall. The asylum reacted immediately. Shadows coalesced into humanoid forms, clawing at her with elongated fingers. The walls trembled, and a deafening hum filled the air. Fighting panic, Margaret moved quickly, painting over twisted faces and writhing limbs. Each stroke seemed to weaken the shadows, but the air grew heavier with every mural she erased. When she reached the basement, the unfinished mural appeared more vivid than ever. The void seemed to ripple, and the shadowy figures around it began to move. Margaret hesitated, fear freezing her in place. A low whisper filled the room, her own voice speaking from the shadows. "Join us. Finish what you've started." Summoning her courage, Margaret dipped her brush into the white paint and began covering the void. The asylum roared in protest, the sound like 1,000 voices crying out at once. The mural bled as she worked, red streaks running down the walls. With a final stroke, the void disappeared, the shadows dissolved, and the asylum let out one last anguished groan before the walls began to collapse. Margaret barely escaped as the asylum crumbled behind her. She stumbled onto the overgrown lawn, coughing from the dust, and collapsed under the pale light of dawn. The hulking structure was now nothing more than rubble, its dark presence finally silenced. In the weeks that followed, Margaret returned home and poured herself into her book. She documented Renwick's art and the asylum's history, but omitted the supernatural details, afraid of how it might be received. Despite her escape, Margaret felt the asylum's lingering presence. Shadows in her apartment stretched unnaturally at night. Her sketches changed when she wasn't looking, the figures growing more distorted. One evening, she found a mural on her living room wall. It depicted the Ashwick Asylum, fully intact, with a lone figure standing at its gates. The figure looked just like her. As Margaret stared at the painting, the shadows around her deepened, and faint whispers began to fill the room.